Brian Burke, a name that resonates with hockey fans for his bold personality and fearless decision-making. As the GM of the Vancouver Canucks, Burke inherited a team in shambles, with a divided locker room and a bleak future. What followed was a whirlwind tenure, marked by feuds with legendary coaches, iconic draft selections, blockbuster trades, and a vision that reshaped the team's destiny. But while Burke built the foundation for years of success, his time with the Canucks wasn't without controversy, marked by playoff heartbreaks and contentious moments. How did Burke transform a struggling franchise into a contender? This is the story of Brian Burke's unforgettable tenure as the Canucks general manager. In the late 90s, the Canucks and their parent company Orca Bay were drowning in debt after being purchased by the McCaw family. These weren't hockey people. They were businessmen, and this was reflected in their decision-making. They wanted superstars that they could market, and in 1996 failed to sign Wayne Gretzky. A year later, they landed Mark Messier, unknowingly dooming the franchise for decades. Other controversial Orca Bay decisions included firing club legend Pat Quinn and bringing in Mike Keenan. The conniving Keenan was able to secure manager duties for himself, and the fire sale of Canucks legends began. Linden, McLean, and Ojic were all gone. This instability led to the Canucks finishing dead last in the West in '98. The Canucks were also in deep trouble financially. When Stan McCammon, CEO of Orca Bay, met with Brian Burke, he outlined all of this. He said the team was swimming in red ink. In the fiscal year that was just wrapping up, it had lost $36 million. The season ticket base had shrunk to about 9,000. I got this quote from Burke's book, Burke's Law. It's one of the best hockey books I've ever read, so go check it out. Burke had one condition before signing with the Canucks. He wanted to meet the owner, John McCaw. He wanted to get a feel for McCaw, figure out what his intentions were. I mentioned in the intro that Burke is known for his bold personality. Well, in his first meeting with McCaw, he straight up just said, "We are going to run this team like a business, which you haven't done before. We are going to play a style that is entertaining, and with Mike Keenan coaching, you haven't been doing that." Burke laid down the gauntlet. Vancouver fans are all too familiar with GMs inheriting coaches. There is never a happy ending. Burke wanted to play a fast, up-tempo style, whereas Keenan's teams would just grind down their opponents. Full credit to Burke for not pulling a Rutherford special and throwing his coach under the bus. When speaking with the media, Burke said, "God, this guy is some coach. Having Mike here is a gift as far as I'm concerned." A public vote of confidence, but in private, Burke sang a different tune. First off, Keenan was only coaching the Canucks because of Messier, and he was a bully. He furthered the divide in the locker room by disrespecting Trevor Linden. And Burke didn't appreciate that. Keep in mind, Burke was the Canucks director of hockey operations when the Canucks drafted Linden, so he had an axe to grind with Keenan. Stan McCammon implored Burke to work with Keenan, and Burke agreed. He told McCammon, "I will try my hardest, but I'm not predicting good things." And he was right. In his very first meeting with Keenan, Keenan asked Burke if he had looked at his contract because he wanted say in personnel decisions. Burke, in no uncertain terms, told him to kick rocks. And what did Keenan do? He ran and complained to ownership, even though Burke's contract gave him full control of hockey operations. Keenan's days were numbered, and this power struggle was apparent very early on. In his first summer on the job, Burke wanted to protect Scott Walker in the expansion draft, whereas Keenan wanted to protect Peter Ziesel. Ownership convinced Burke to let Keenan win this one, but Burke was right all along. Ziesel went on to play half a season. Walker went on to play another 11 seasons in the NHL. Burke states, "I was sick over it, but I took one for the team, or more accurately, for the owners." Burke made the decision to appease ownership, and it backfired. He learned from this mistake and never strayed from his convictions again. And this includes the Pavel Bure situation, which we will get to shortly. The final straw for Keenan was the goalie pulling incident in Toronto. Early in the season, Keenan was pissed that the Canucks wouldn't trade Bure. He needed help all over his roster, so in protest, when the Canucks were down 3-1 only 2 minutes into the third, he pulled Garth Snow. The Leafs didn't score, but then 2 minutes later, Keenan did it again, and the Leafs made it 4-1. After the game, Burke confronted Keenan about this petulant stunt. Keenan said, "You have to trade Bure and get me some help," to which Burke replied, "Two things, Mike. One, I'm going to trade Pavel Bure when I can get value for him. And the second thing, if you ever pull a goalie again in the middle of a game, other than on a delayed penalty, I'm going to come down to the bench and beat you within an inch of your life in front of the crowd and the players and everyone else." If Keenan had any goodwill left with Burke, it all went away when he tried to publicly humiliate his GM. In January, Keenan was out and Mark Crawford was in, which wasn't cheap. The Canucks had to give the Avs a second rounder and $200,000 in compensation. On top of this, they had to pay out Keenan. Imagine how hard Burke worked behind the scenes to convince a franchise that was in debt to do this. That's how bad he wanted Keenan out. Before we get to the Pavel Bure trade, if you're enjoying this video, please drop a like and subscribe. I've set a goal to hit 25,000 subs in 2025, and I'd love for you to be a part of it. Thank you. Burke faced a tough dilemma when he arrived. The most exciting player in franchise history, the Russian Rocket, Pavel Bure was done with the franchise. He felt disrespected by the organization and didn't enjoy the spotlight of being in a Canadian market. He wanted to go out east. This was the only player the Canucks could realistically market to their season ticket holders. He was the reason they were able to build their new arena in the first place. He was their meal ticket. Moving forward without him was going to be difficult, but he was hell-bent on leaving. Burke tried to convince him to stay and reminded him that he helped him break free of his contract with the Red Army in 1991. Bure responded, "Burkie, it's not about you. I do owe you, but the way this organization has treated me, there are things that can't be fixed." Now he's probably referring to the BS story leaked by someone within the organization that he threatened to sit out the 94 finals if he didn't get a new contract. Burke, however, was in no rush to trade his superstar. He had to get this trade right if he wanted to rebuild this franchise. He stated, "I'm not going to trade him unless there's a deal on the table that makes sense for our hockey club. I've made it very clear to Pavel and his agent that he will be suspended if there is no deal in place before the regular season begins." Bure felt so angered by the franchise that he was willing to forego millions of dollars in salary by sitting out until he was traded. He was coming off a 50-goal season, so the Canucks weren't too worried about his trade value. But the longer it dragged out, the riskier it got for Burke. He was hedging his bets on a GM being desperate enough by January to make an offer he couldn't refuse. Enter Brian Murray, GM of the Panthers. The Panthers were a financial mess, bigger than the Canucks, which is saying a lot. They needed a superstar. The Canucks had one, and a deal was struck. The Canucks received 1994 first overall pick Ed Jovanovski, Mike Brown, Dave Gagne, Kevin Weeks, and a first which they used to select Nathan Smith. Burke reflects on this trade in his book. "I'll admit, I didn't get full value. Not even close, but it was the best I could do." The fans were not happy with the return. In a Victoria Times article, a fan wrote, "You waited way too long to pull the trigger on Bure and your team suffered greatly for it. To many fans, it will be known as the flop of all trades. What were you thinking? However, there is still one thing you can do if you truly believe that your job is to help the team succeed. Give yourself 2 weeks notice and then fire yourself." An emotional Canucks fan overreacting immediately after a transaction? Some things just never change. This fan's name, Mike LaRue. Has anyone ever seen this guy and Mike from Surrey in the same room before? Comment down below. Now that Burke had dealt with his two most pressing issues, the real work began. Now, because the Canucks were in debt, the only way to rebuild was through the draft and trades. They couldn't rely on free agent signings. Burke even stated, "When you're talking about adding players who make $2 or $3 million a year, the first thing you have to ask yourself is where is that money going to come from? You know, we criticize the Aquilinis a lot, but at least they're willing to spend money. Orca Bay was cheap. Also, prior to the lockout, players weren't eligible for free agency until 31. So we're just going to focus on Burke's trades and draft record in this video. In 1999, Thomas Grudin approached Brian Burke and told him that he had to draft both Sedins. The Canucks only held the 3rd overall pick. And Burke replied, "Have you lost your friggin' mind? Nobody has ever picked twice in the top 4. How am I supposed to get 2 top picks?" On top of that, Burke wasn't sold on the Sedins. In fact, he wasn't a fan of the entire draft and was willing to move the Canucks first rounder until he saw the Sedins play at the World Championships. He saw what we all were lucky to witness for 17 seasons, the twin telepathy. When he returned to Vancouver, he told assistant GM Dave Nonis that they were going to draft both of them. A tall task indeed, but if anyone was going to pull it off, it was the wheeling and dealing Brian Burke. But it wasn't going to be cheap. Burke was going to have to part ways with a lot of assets, picks, and young players. He started the process weeks before the draft, but ran into a roadblock. Bob Murray of Chicago was not willing to part with the 4th selection unless the Canucks gave him Brian McCabe and their 2000 first-round pick. This was a highly risky move. The Canucks were bottom feeders, and that first could have realistically been a 1st overall. McCabe was no slouch either. Imagine the left side of Jovanovski, Oland, and McCabe. Perhaps Burke believed that he was trading from a position of strength. And McCabe was moved. The next step was to get the first overall pick from Tampa, which wasn't going to be easy. After a tense negotiation the night before the draft, the ball was in Rick Dudley's court, the GM of the Lightning. If Dudley didn't accept the Canucks' offer of their 4th overall and 2/3, the Canucks were screwed. Burke recalls, "It was a long wait, or at least it felt like one. When Dudley finally came in, he put down his stuff and then came directly to us. Alright, I will do your deal. 2/3. The Canucks now held the 1st and 3rd overall selection. But there was one loose end to tie up. Atlanta and the 2nd overall pick. I always thought the Canucks were afraid that Don Waddell and the Thrashers would take a Sedin, so they made a deal with them. Turns out, the Thrashers didn't even care. They were going to take Patrick Stefan regardless. Burke was just lazy. He didn't want to walk up to the stage twice. He also netted a 3rd rounder from Atlanta for the privilege of picking 1st overall. Tidy work. The rest, as they say, was history. The Canucks selected no other NHLers in 1999, so let's evaluate Burke's next 5 drafts. If I could describe them in one word, wildly inconsistent. Sorry, I lied, that's 2 words. Let's start with his greatest hits. Kevin Bieksa, 5th round, 151st overall in 2001. Ryan Kesler, 23rd overall in 2003. And Burke deserves credit for this one, because he personally saw Ryan Kesler play at Ohio State and moved him up the rankings. 2004 was Burke's finest work. Corey Schneider, 26th overall. Alex Edler, 3rd round, 91st overall. Tough guy Mike Brown, 5th round, 159th overall. And Yannick Hansen, 287th overall in a round that doesn't even exist anymore. Most of these selections were key players in the 2011 Cup run, but that doesn't necessarily mean that Burke did a good job. For one, he didn't get a single NHLer in the 2000 draft. Nathan Smith was selected with the 1st rounder they got for Bure. This was their chance to appease the fans that criticized that trade, and they blew it. To make matters worse, longtime NHLers Brad Boyes and Steve Ott went right after Smith. They got juice in 2001, and RJ Umberger was the right pick at 16. But Burke botched the contract negotiations, and the Burger demanded a trade before landing in New York. All because Burke didn't want to pay him the max rookie contract. The Canucks didn't have a 1st in 2002. They used it to reacquire Trevor Linden, but they still had 11 draft picks. Surely, they could find one regular NHLer, right? Wrong. 12 games combined for this draft. The Canucks had another 10 picks in 2003 and selected Ryan Kesler, but after that, nothing. This is more disappointing than you think because 03 was one of the deepest drafts ever. There were legit NHLers going off the board in the 2nd, where the Canucks took Marc-Andre Bernier. Right after him went Max Lapierre, who eventually became a Canuck, and David Backes, who the Canucks tried to offer sheet in 2008. 2004 was one of the best drafts in Canucks history. Nothing else needs to be said. So overall, excellent work with the Sedins, although that was more trading than it was scouting and drafting. Good late round picks in Bieksa, Edler, and Hansen, but not getting an NHLer in 2000 or 2002 really hurts. If I had to give Burke a letter grade for drafting, I'd give him a C+. On to his trades. Let's start with the losses. Obviously, the Bure trade was a loss because he butchered the Nathan Smith pick. And Kevin Weeks didn't turn into the goalie of the future he predicted. Weeks was flipped for Felix Potvin, who also became part of the goalie graveyard. This one's going to be controversial, but the Trevor Linden trade was a definite L. Simply because of the member of the Capitals. I know intangibles matter, but this wasn't the Linden of 1994 anymore. I also think that Burke lost the Kluche trade. Fine regular season goalie, but atrocious in the playoffs. They could have gotten someone better for Adrian Aucoin. Finally, Pittsburgh turned the Johan Hedberg trade into a loss for the Canucks. They drafted Alex Goligoski with Vancouver's 2nd rounder. Goligoski just retired last season after playing over 1,000 games. Let's look at some of Burke's wins. A 6th rounder for Trent Klatt was a decent deal. Getting Brendan Morrison for an aging Alexander McGillney was decent value. But his best work was shoring up the D. He acquired Sami Salo for Peter Schaefer and Marek Malik in a deal involving Harold Druken. But the best trade was the one that he didn't make. Burke had a rule that if a veteran requested a trade, he was gone. He knew the struggling Marcus Naslund was about to request one, and when Naslund walked into his office, Burke said, "Don't say anything. Don't say a word, because I have a feeling I know what you're going to say. And once you say those words, I will trade you. I don't want to trade you. I think you're going to be a really good hockey player, but Marcus, you're stealing money right now. You're not working hard enough. You're not scoring goals. You're not back-checking. You're a liability defensively." This tough love was necessary, and Marcus Naslund went on to become one of the greatest Canucks in history. He was an integral part of the rebuild, one that Burke was able to pull off in a surprisingly short amount of time. Rebuilds can take an incredibly long time. Just look at the Yzerplan in Detroit, now in year 6. Let's say a true teardown rebuild takes 5 years to compete for a playoff spot. Burke was able to get the Canucks back to the playoffs in year 3. What made this more impressive is the fact that the Canucks lost leading scorer and captain Marcus Naslund to injury late in the season. Burke stated, "There's no reason it has to be a catastrophe, even losing a player of that caliber. We set a goal at the start of the year, and that goal was to make the playoffs. That goal was damn near impossible, because the Canucks' record with Naslund was drastically better than without. It wasn't just Naslund and his broken fibia. Their best center, Andrew Castles, was out as well. The Canucks limped across the finish line with only 2 wins in their final 17 games, but a Harold Druken goal against the Kings in the second to last game of the season secured their first playoff berth in 5 years. Their reward was a first-round matchup against the Colorado Avalanche, who quickly beat them in 4 games. That offseason, the Canucks didn't sign any new free agents or make any major trades. They were hoping for internal growth, but this strategy was unsuccessful against the other Western Conference powerhouse, the Detroit Red Wings, who dispatched the Canucks in 6 games with their $70 million payroll. The Canucks were like the Oakland A's at the time, playing Moneyball. After this series loss, Burke was questioned about his spending and said, "I have no intention of changing how I do business here. You've seen that movie here when we went out and signed a high-priced free agent, and guess what? It didn't work." The high-priced free agent he was referring to was Mark Messier. Mark Messier video linked down in the comment section. Burke was true to his word. He told John McCaw he was going to run the team like a business, and he did. He wasn't interested in overpaying free agents, restricted or unrestricted. Just because the Canucks were finally profitable didn't mean Burke was going to loosen the purse strings. He had faith in his players. The team was on the come-up. As the youngest team in the playoffs, we're just going to get better. I don't see any need to go out and get a high-priced guy, and I think history has proven that it's a miserable failure in most cases. Another offseason of no free agent signings, and a belief in internal growth. To his credit, early in the 02-03 season, Brian Burke shored up his defense by acquiring Sami Salo and Marek Malik. Along with Matthias Ohlund, Ed Jovanovski, and Brent Sopel, this was one of the deepest and most well-rounded D-cores in the league. Bertuzzi and Naslund had the best seasons of their careers, leading the team to a franchise-best 104 points. Remarkably, their biggest competitors, the Avalanche and Red Wings, both lost their first-round series. This was their year to make a run. The vibes were incredibly high, especially after coming back from a 3-1 series deficit against the St. Louis Blues. Even club legend Trevor Linden got in on the scoring in Game 7. But then came the Wild, who were coached by Jacques Lemaire, a man whose playing style Brian Burke hated. Prior to the series, Burke said, "It's not a hockey team, it's a cult. They have totally bought into their system. They work hard and have excellent team speed. It's going to be a very, very difficult opponent for us." The Canucks got off to an encouraging start, taking a commanding 3-1 series lead. But Burke foreshadowed their collapse. He said, "They bang, they work. They are a lunch pail, blue-collar, no-name team. You have to be patient because they are patient. They're like a python. They wait for you to make a mistake and move very quickly." Like a python waiting in the grass, the Wild struck in Game 5. They ran Dan Cloutier out the building in a 7-2 victory. The Canucks were shell-shocked and eventually lost the series in 7. They'd squandered a golden opportunity to advance with their Western Conference rivals out the picture. Most of the blame for this loss has to be placed on Dan Cloutier. He gave up 15 goals on 60 shots from games 5 to 7, but the Stars also cratered. Burke's job now was to add some veterans that could help the Canucks take that next step. But again, he didn't add any free agents or make any meaningful trades heading into the next season. A season in which the Canucks lost their star power forward to an on-ice incident that lives in infamy. Burke has some interesting thoughts about this in his book. After the original hit on Naslund by Moore, Burke wanted revenge, but within the code of honor in hockey. He states, "My idea of retaliation for the Avalanche targeting our captain was to go after their captain, Joe Sakic. They get our best player. We're going after their best player, but cleanly and legally." Obviously, this is not how things played out, and not only was there a league investigation, there was a criminal one as well. For the sake of time, I won't get into details, plus this is a video about Burke, not the incident. But I will leave you with this quote from Burke's book, which again, I highly recommend. "We went from concern for the kid, wondering if he would ever play again, if he would ever walk again, to wondering if we were getting played by the Avalanche. Were they trying to milk this and get the biggest suspension they could?" Which is exactly what they did. To this day, I'm convinced that the injuries weren't severe enough to end his career. Burke was left with a 230-pound hole on his top line, and the very next day at the trade deadline, he acquired Jeff Sanderson and Martin Ruchinski. But unfortunately, these guys were completely useless. The Canucks also went through 3 goalies in their series against the Flames, losing a heartbreaker in Game 7. The West Coast Express was never the same after they returned from the lockout, and Brian Burke's days in Vancouver came to an end. After losing to the Flames, Burke's contract wasn't renewed, but he describes it in his book as a firing. He gives two main reasons, one being the Bertuzzi contract negotiations. Burke agreed to a deal with the Star Wingers camp that bought up all his RFA years. All it required was a signing bonus and a $7 million salary. McCaw, the owner, wanted the bonus to be as low as possible, but Burke had already negotiated the deal. In his book he writes, "There was conflict over this offer. John and I had words. We did the deal, but the confrontation gave McCammon the ammunition to convince John that I wasn't a team player. Which is what they told me when they declined to renew my contract at the end of the season." McCammon's legacy with the Canucks is a complicated one. He was a shadowy figure and seemingly incompetent at running things, and Burke didn't trust him at all. He shouldn't have trusted anyone at Orca Bay. He had a clause in his contract that would have paid him $1 million if the Canucks were sold for $80. If they were sold for $85, he would have been paid $1.5 million. Behind the scenes, John McCaw received an offer from the Aquilini, Gagliardi, and Beattie coalition for a ton of money. But Orca Bay stalled. They wanted to cut Burke out of the deal, and Stan McCammon admitted this to Gagliardi. Burke eventually got the last laugh. When Messier sued the Canucks for the phantom stock he was owed after their sale, who did he call to testify on his behalf? That's right, Brian Burke. Burke knew about the Canucks' finances more than anyone, and his testimony helped Messier win millions from the Canucks. It wasn't McCaw or McCammon who had to pay him. It was Aquilini. So how can we view Burke's legacy as GM of the Canucks, decades later after all the dust has settled? Well, let's start at the beginning. He inherited a team that lost $36 million in a fiscal year, and within 4 seasons he broke even. A lot of this was because of his personal sales touch, communicating directly with season ticket holders. The team was then sold for a huge profit, so commercially, he was a huge success. In his first season, the team only had 58 points, but 2 years later was back in the playoffs, with 90 points. He may have inherited Naslund and Bertuzzi, but he surrounded them with players like Castles, Morrison, Jovanovski, Klatt, and the Sedins. Burke played an integral role in getting the Canucks back to the playoffs in just his 3rd season. Without his stability and vision, the Canucks would have continued their tailspin under Orca Bay. Once he got them to the playoffs, however, Burke wasn't able to get the team to the next level. I know first-line centers don't grow on trees, but the West Coast Express did well in spite of Brendan Morrison, not because of him. Kluche? What else is there to say? He had a save percentage of .750 from games 5 to 7 against the Wild. It's unfortunate Burke wasn't able to fill these 2 holes. It's also unfortunate he wasn't able to draft well, because this would have really helped make up for his lack of free agent signings. The 2000 draft in particular really hurt this team, as those players would have been ready to compete by 2004. But Burke's story didn't end in 2004. His legacy continued for over a decade. The Sedins, Bieksa, Edler, Kessler, Hansen, Salo were all part of the best Canucks teams to ever exist. If they had just won that series, Burke probably would have deserved an honorary ring. Personally, I think Burke is one of the better GMs in Canucks history, even with his flaws. But I want to know what you think. What's his legacy with the Vancouver Canucks? Comment down below, and if you enjoyed this video, please subscribe. I'm trying to hit 25,000 subs in 2025, and I can do it with your help. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.